This is Hidden Histories in Australian Politics. I'm Jenna Gray, and today I'm going to be asking the question, why hate the Greens? What drives the animosity towards the progressive left? The Australian Greens are gaining credibility in politics. They're still a minority party, and with 30 years of campaigning behind them, who are they? And why is there so much hate directed at the Greens from their political opponents? For many in Australia, the Greens' story is one they know and can talk about from experience. For others, the background behind this activist group is new. If you want to learn more about the history behind the Greens and follow along as I try to understand some of the political pressures and backstories that caused stalemates in policy and the vitriolic attacks on the Greens Party and their political representatives. During the 1970s and 80s, what is now the Australian Greens emerged as disparate groups of activists fighting to protect irreplaceable environmental treasures for idealistic and humanistic causes. The enemy was complacency and the underlying political support for industrialised desecration of land and looting of public assets, and the harm to human life caused by war. The trajectory of environmental politics to the formation of today's strong and aligned Greens Party can be followed from the formation of these fledgling activist groups through to organised attempts to gain more political power by campaigning and winning electoral seats both at state and federal level. The Australian Greens, as the National Party is now known, applies 4 key principles to its policies: ecological sustainability, grassroots democracy, social justice, and peace and non-violence. These principles narrow down the driving motivations of many individual groups that mobilised over local or single issues, but found a collective voice under the progressive left umbrella of the Greens movement. Who were the first environmentalists? The Australian Greens creation story starts in Tasmania, with the focus on the environmental fight between activists, local politicians, and a plan to use hydropower to sell electricity to Australia. The story of the flooding of Lake Pedder and the fight to save the Franklin River is embedded in the Greens' history. But the story of the Greens is more than one of a group of activists spreading their message outwards. Simultaneously around Australia and elsewhere in the world, individuals and groups were motivated to try to slow down or halt the unrelenting march towards total human domination of the environment and natural resources. Tasmania. Briefly, the Tasmanian story starts with the United Tasmania Group, a political party formed to contest elections by the Lake Pedder Action Committee in 1972. Lake Pedder was a pristine lake in a remote part of Tasmania, scheduled to become part of the hydroelectric project, flooding the entire valley. The United Tasmania Group didn't win any seats or save the lake, but they did go on to achieve notoriety and protect much of the Franklin River from the same fate as Lake Pedder. It was one of the most important environmental campaigns in Australian history. Tasmania was unique because it has had a proportional voting system since the 1860s, and it was this that allowed the Greens to win 5 seats in 1989. Charismatic spokesperson and eventual Greens leader Bob Brown co-signed a deal to support Labor in a minority government with the Labor-Greens Accord. The Accord allowed the Greens, who held the balance of power, some political wins, but eventually collapsed. Bob Brown and the Greens were popular, and defections to the party were coming from both sides of the political spectrum. Greens MPs were starting to look less like students and hippies, portrayed during the Franklin River Blockade, and more like neighbours and community members. New Zealand. New Zealand established the first national level Greens party, called the Values Party, in 1972, soon after Tasmania. This was an environmentalist party, providing a political platform covering the middle ground between Marxist-Leninist parties of the time and centre-left politics. Although the Values Party never won a seat, its members profoundly influenced the political discussions of the day and other blossoming environmental and social justice movements. Values reached momentum in 1978, but disadvantaged by the first-past-the-post system and a misalignment with the nation's sentiment, they experienced a crushing defeat and went into decline with infighting, disorganisation and factions. By 1987, Values were calling themselves the Green Party of Aotearoa and calling for proportional representation, which was adopted in 1994. The party dissolved in 1989, re-emerging as the Greens Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand. They entered government in 1996 and formed part of the government in 2017. New South Wales. In the early 70s, local residents in Sydney wanted to save bushland on the harbour foreshore from developer A.V. Jennings. The Builders and Labourers Union had for some years been advocating on behalf of ethical developments, keeping Sydney's historical sites intact, protecting low-income housing and investing in high-quality public utilities. The residents group, calling themselves the Battlers for Kelly's Bush, had been turned down by the local council, so they approached the Builders and Labourers Union to support their cause. The condition for the union was that the battlers, who were 13 women, could show significant community support, and they did just that, with about 600 people turning up for a public meeting. The Builders and Labourers Union agreed to help and brought down a green ban on the project, saving Kelly's Bush. Other activist residents groups followed suit, and the green bans in Sydney protected iconic places such as the Rocks, the Botanic Gardens, Centennial Park, and others. Green bans were used in other cities, but Sydney achieved the most dramatic success. Eventually, national union leaders, encouraged by politicians, dismissed the New South Wales leaders and replaced them. Green bans continued with other unions, but things got nasty when local King's Cross resident activists were harassed by thugs. One person was kidnapped and another, Juanita Nelson, was murdered. The Green Union bans lasted for about 4 years, but the name Green had begun to circulate and take hold. German activist and founding German Greens member Petra Kelly visited Australia and was inspired by the successes in Australia and by policies developed in New Zealand. In New South Wales, Greens New South Wales was launched as a political party in 1984. Western Australia and the Nuclear Disarmament Party. In Western Australia, Joe Valentine won a seat as a minority party member in 1984 under the banner of the Nuclear Disarmament Party. Later, after the party split and lost ground, Valentine represented the Greens Western Australia Party on the Senate in 1991. From 1984, there was a rise in the number of people affiliating with peace groups, including professionals, women, students, and regional groups. In 1985, there were 350 peace groups officially in Australia. Initially, nuclear disarmament groups intended to support the Australian Labor Party in stopping the mining and export of uranium, withdrawing from nuclear bases, and stopping the passage of nuclear-armed weapons through Australian waters or airspace. When Labour leader Bob Hawke's government conceded to mining interests on uranium and supported a US nuclear alliance, the Nuclear Disarmament Party formed and contested seats. In 1984, the party won 4% of the vote in every state and 7.5% of the total. Despite the positive result, a lack of preferences in the voting system prevented lead singer of Australian band Midnight Oil Peter Garrett from winning a seat in the lower house in New South Wales, and the same for Jean Meltzer in Victoria. After this defeat, the Nuclear Disarmament Party struggled to gain momentum, and factional fighting emerged between idealists with radical views and groups wanting more broader policies and centralism. The party split in 1985 after members resigned, including sitting Senator Joe Valentine, claiming that the party was being taken over by the Socialist Workers' Party, a Marxist revolutionary group. Even in this short duration, the Nuclear Disarmament Party shows what is possible, but also illuminates how emerging political groups can fizzle out after the first wave of excitement and success without a cohesive strategy and goals. Further state-based Green parties were starting to appear. The Brisbane Party was established in 1984, contesting city council wards. They collapsed in 1986, forming the Queensland Greens. Their co-founder was Drew Hutton, who also co-founded the National Australian Greens with Bob Brown. Hutton narrowly missed winning a Senate seat in 2004. His work as an environmental activist has been lifelong, tireless and prolific. Now in his senior years, he is still affiliated with the Lock the Gate Alliance, which he helped establish, that combines the interests of landowners, farmers, traditional custodians, urban residents and conservationists on environmental issues. All other Australian states established state-based Greens parties in response to the formation of the National Australian Greens in 1992, which united the existing parties of Tasmania, Queensland and New South Wales. Western Australia joined the National Greens in 2003 after merging two groups, including the Western Australian Greens Party. What drives environmental groups to take action? In a study on the characteristics of environmental change activists, researchers learnt by analysing nearly 500 environmental change groups that the lessons learned by the Greens in their advocacy are effective. These are working together with other groups to help pool resources, share information and avoid doubling up. Groups are often advocating for local change. Larger groups can help support smaller groups on issues with a lower profile. State the campaign goal and target clearly. Targets such as more website hits, social media engagement, volunteers and donations. Maximise the website to engage, educate and bring in more support. Other research has shown that civil resistance has mixed results in achieving change. While environmentalists and conservationists built interest and avid following with the Franklin blockade, the Greens have continued to grow by aligning with like-minded local groups and selling their clear, consistent messaging. Civil resistance gets more exposure in the media and raises awareness. It can be an outlet for frustration, but it doesn't always change hearts and minds. Who is the opposition? Clearly, the strongest opposition to the Greens comes from the right side of the political spectrum, the Liberal Party and its coalition partner, the Nationals. And yet partnerships can occur when the opportunity arises to undermine the Labor Party policies, gain ground in negotiation, or split the vote away from Labor. In cities, Liberal seats are falling to or coming close to falling to Greens candidates. But often it's Labor and the Greens who are the most vocal about their differences. Greens and Labour are tussling for left-wing voters. The fight can be bitter. On issues of ideology, Labour and Greens are both allies and opponents. To hold power, Labour aims to appease a broad group of constituents and sidestep anything too controversial that will resonate with swing voters. Straddling the concerns of environmental groups and inner city progressives while keeping workers' fears about job security at bay is a delicate task for Labour, and calculations are needed to balance the sentiment in key winnable seats. Although Labour and the Greens are aligned in a philosophy of higher taxation and more social support, the Greens constituency is drawn from activist groups who want to see their party leaders demonstrate political influence by confronting the status quo, facing up to and calling out industrialised greed, challenging mainstream beliefs embedded in the public domain, and representing the marginalised and social welfare recipients. As the underdog, the Greens view their wins as achievements in the fight for good. When Greens share power, at times the Greens have the opportunity to share power when their partner fails to win a majority. Labour and the Greens have had mixed results with this. While this arrangement allows both sides to get their policies into law, conflicts in priorities can cause irrevocable tension. In the ACT, Greens Party members have been sharing power with Labour since 2008. This has been successful in the progressive territory, but in Tasmania, a conservative state, when this arrangement has been attempted, it has been short-lived. The 1989 Tasmanian Labour-Greens Accord was abandoned after 14 months. Greens members at the time said that some of the Labour leadership were openly hostile and had no intention of making the collaboration a success. Other political commentators see coalitions as the ultimate expression of democracy, but they are inherently unstable. Kate Crowley, political commentator and adjunct professor at the University of Tasmania, argues that sharing power is good for the minor party, but often works against the major partner. In Tasmania, collaborative partnerships have been dissolved, and in the most recent election, Labour refused to partner with the Greens, handing over the chance to form a government to the opposition. Compromise is how the Greens and Labour need to manage their agendas, and with each bill, there comes a trade-off between the brave and the ideal, and the safe and the uncontroversial. Labour argues that the Greens will shoot themselves in the foot by holding out for impractical ideals, citing the carbon pollution reduction scheme in 2011, skittling all plans to go ahead with the scheme and foreshadowing political attacks by the opposition and Tony Abbott. After this PR disaster, the Greens do seem to have learned to temper their opposition and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Countercultural movement. Environmentalist groups, especially in the late 20th century, were the countercultural movement. Derision and divisiveness was shown by polarising media portrayals, stereotyping protesters as hippies, dull bludgers, the unwashed and disobedient, and conveniently dismissing environmental and social justice causes as being at odds with good economic policy. Do Australians just hate trees? Environmentalists have their supporters, but is it part of the Australian psyche to just hate trees and want to tame the natural environment into neat and orderly submission? Some would argue this is so. From the huge hydro dam projects which were envisioned to bring prosperity to Tasmania, to the desperation to save old growth forests, not just in Tasmania, but in other states as well, forests first fell to be sold as hardwood, then to make way for farmland. Now they fall to make way for developments and highways, and they fall to be tragically sold as wood chip and paper pulp. Despite all the efforts of the Greens, they haven't been able to halt the unrelenting destruction of bushland. In many places, trees have not even been kept to protect domestic pastoral animals, sheep, cattle, horses, from the elements. Trees are disliked in the suburbs for crimes such as restricting views, dropping litter and occasionally branches, tearing up footpaths and getting into drains. There are ways to get around these problems, but often Aussie individualists want to take matters into their own hands with chainsaws or poison and commit arboreal vandalism on established trees. While Indigenous cultures recognise the systems of nature and that trees support life, scholars have considered how the colonial settler legacy has created a disconnection with nature and a hostility towards the land. Or do we not have the political systems in place that support reasonable, sustainable regulation? Today, the Australian Greens hold some political influence with a prominent position in politics. They have 11 members in the federal Senate, which gives them serious opportunity to support and even shape the government's agenda, and 4 seats in the lower house. At state level, they share power and coalition with the ACT and hold crossbench seats in all states apart from the Northern Territory. Importantly, they're shaping the conversation. They speak with passion and are battle-hardened in politics. During the Franklin River Blockade, volunteers were trained in resistance tactics and civil disobedience. Now the Greens have matured as a credible political party, leveraging their position to pressure major parties to do more. For the renters, for young people, for low-income earners, and the environment. Green has become synonymous with the environment, and it's easy to connect the name of the party with one of its most prominent causes. Thank you for watching. Do you agree with this account of the historic background and the rise of the Australian Greens? Have I missed anything important? I'd love to hear your views in the comments. You've been listening to Hidden Histories in Australian Politics. This is Jenna Gray.